Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. Today's video is going to be about how I passed the JLPT N2 back in 2021. I've been procrastinating the making of this video like I do with most things in my life, which is why I'm making it now, almost 1.5 years after I actually took the exam. But better late than never, so here we are. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you have any questions, leave a comment down below and I'll do my best to answer them. So the JLPT, as you probably know if you're watching this video right now, stands for the Japanese Language Proficiency Test. It's the most popular test used to determine a person's level of Japanese. I took the JLPT N2 in December of 2021 and I passed with 171 out of 180 points. Here's my certificate and my results sheet, which, funnily enough, I also procrastinated picking these up from the Japanese embassy, so I think you can see that procrastination is sort of in my nature. I'm going to share some tips and tricks that I used to pass the JLPT N2, which is still applicable to the other levels as well. If this video helps you out, please leave a like and subscribe. Now let's get into it. For a little bit of backstory, I originally intended to take the JLPT N3 in December of 2020. However, because of the pandemic, the exam was cancelled. Around that time, I did some past exam papers and I could see that I was already at the N3 level when the cancellation was announced in around March or April of 2020. And I didn't see the point of waiting an entire year just to take the same level again. So I decided to push myself to take the N2. The JLPT N2 is the only level I've officially taken, but I've studied for all of them. I'd already started learning N2 kanji by that point because I'd finished learning all of the N3 kanji already. So I started studying for the N2 immediately after I heard the exam was cancelled, and my school exams were also cancelled because of COVID, so I had a lot of time to focus on Japanese. And even when school started up online, I still had more time than usual to keep on studying, and I spent a lot of online classes with Anki Open doing reviews, which is good for my Japanese, but not good for school, so I don't recommend it. I would also like to mention that I didn't pay for any resources in Japanese before doing the test, so I essentially reached this level using only free resources. I wouldn't really recommend this as it's probably the hard way of doing things, but I didn't have any way to get my hands on any Japanese resources, so I suppose my story could be a way of proving that in today's internet age, it's possible to get to an advanced level in Japanese without paying anything. Now, of course, if you want to buy textbooks, go ahead, but I can't give any recommendations since I didn't use any myself. The JLPT has three main sections: language knowledge, reading and listening. In the JLPT N5 and N4, the language knowledge and reading sections are in one paper. For the other levels, they're in different papers. All of the questions are multiple choice, and you choose from 3 or 4 possible answers. This makes it possible to just go in blind and guess, which makes it easier from a test taker's perspective, but also makes it a little bit less reliable as a measure of your Japanese ability. That and the fact that there's no speaking or writing section means that the JLPT is definitely one of the less robust language tests, but it can still be used as a way to measure your progress, and it's still needed by employers and universities in Japan, so I still think it's worth it if you want to. I honestly don't completely understand the way the JLPT is graded. It's not exactly correlated to the exact number of questions you get right. According to their website, they use a system called scaled scores. I'll do my best to explain it briefly, but honestly I don't fully understand it myself, so be sure to check out the official website, which I'll link in the description if you want to know more. Basically, they have to make a new test every year with at least some new questions. This means that the actual difficulty of the test may differ between years, so people may have the same level of Japanese, but one person might fail and another might pass just because they took the same level of an exam during a different session. So to counter this, they began to use a system called scaled scores, and this basically means that the scores are determined mathematically based on answering patterns of how the examinees answer particular questions. Each particular answering pattern, or combination of correct or incorrect answers, is positioned on a scale from 0 to 60. This means that you can have the same score as someone else despite having a different number of questions correct because your answering patterns were valued the same, or have a higher score than someone else despite getting fewer questions right because you had a higher ranking answering pattern. Again, check out the website if you want to see the full explanation of how it works, but that's just a brief summary. For most levels, you need around 50% to pass, but you also need around 30% in each of the 3 sections to pass. I did the N2 and you needed 90 out of 180 to pass and 19 out of 60 in each section. I was fairly certain I'd pass each section, and the only part that I was a bit worried about was the reading section. I read a lot leading up to the exam, but it was mostly fiction, and I did read the news very often, but it would almost always be short articles because I found the news a bit boring. I did do some practice tests, but I wasn't sure how I would hold with the long passages in the final exam. However, that ended up being the least of my troubles. So, I'd been studying for this exam for over a year, and I was so prepared for the test that I started to get lazy. Like I said earlier, I decided to take the N2 in March of 2020, but the exam would be held in December of 2021. That was a lot of time to move up one level, and it's the reason I did so well in the exam. I actually think I would have done better if I was more pressed for time, like if I was able to take the N2 exam in 2020, because I feel like my Japanese was really at its peak in October of 2020. But back to my test day. It was not great. For whatever reason, I decided I didn't need a good night's sleep, and I went to bed at 2 a.m. and woke up at 7 a.m. It wasn't even nerves or last-minute studying, it was just me not thinking ahead. And then I didn't eat breakfast. Again, not because of nerves, I was just running late and wanted to get out of the house. I don't usually skip breakfast, so I don't know why I thought it would be a good idea on the day of a big exam. And then, I didn't carry a coat, and I was just wearing a thin shirt. And usually the weather is pretty good, but of course on that day, it was absolutely freezing and I was struggling to neatly block out the boxes with my hands shaking. I didn't even carry water, but luckily I wasn't thirsty. I literally don't know what was going through my head on that day to make me so unprepared for the exam. I'm usually super organised and over-prepared for anything I do. I guess I just wasn't taking it as seriously as I should have because of how long I had to wait. It was a struggle in the beginning, but I started to focus on the questions and I forgot about the cold and the fatigue. That was until the listening section. This is at the very end, after 105 minutes of vocabulary and grammar and reading comprehension, so my brain was fried and I was struggling to concentrate. Luckily, listening is one of my best skills in Japanese, so I only really had difficulty with the last 3 questions, which in the N2 are very long passages where you had to listen to a conversation where 4 things were mentioned and compare them. Then at the end, you get a question asking you which of the 4 things the speakers had chosen or should choose. This was already extremely tiring for me at the best of times, but for that morning, it was infinitely worse. For the last question, it felt like I literally couldn't hear anything. Like all of a sudden they were just speaking a different language. I didn't hear any of the 4 things they were talking about. Like I literally didn't know what they were talking about at all. So I just guessed something and hoped for the best. I left the test in a really bad mood, completely convinced that I'd failed, or at most just barely passed. So you can imagine my shock when I saw my results in January, and they were actually really, really good. I did find it a shame that listening ended up being my worst section, even though I completely understand why, but I'd really focused on it and I'd improved a lot. It was certainly better than my reading. So if you've also done the JLPT in the past, please let me know in the comments below whether or not you were ever shocked in a good or bad way by your test results overall or by section. The JLPT is an exam like any other, so general exam rules apply, like being silent, including keeping phones and in most cases watches away, and obviously no cheating. Make sure you answer every question. If you're running out of time, move on and come back, and if you still can't figure out the answer, just pick something, but try to make an educated guess. There should be at least one answer you can eliminate, and there's at least a 25% chance that you get the answer correct, but if you don't answer, you have a 0% chance of getting it right. Stay hydrated. Bring a water bottle so you can stay focused and comfortable. You'll most likely not be allowed to leave the room at any point during the exam, so make sure you use the bathroom before. Get a good night's sleep. This is obvious, you can't concentrate if you're tired, and you need a clear head to get through those dense Japanese texts in the reading section, and to focus in the listening section. Watch your time management. A lot of people say they felt rushed to finish the test. I personally didn't have this issue, but make sure that you do practice exams to learn how much time to allocate to each question, so you can give each question a fair chance. Start early. Now of course this depends on your level before, but don't expect to study for 2 days or even 2 weeks before the test and pass with flying colours. You should do the bulk of your studying months before the test, and in the 3 weeks leading up to the test you should just be reviewing. Make sure you do past papers before the exam. The JLPT has a few confusing types of questions, so it's important that you understand how to do all of the types of questions beforehand, so you don't let that interfere on the day of the exam. Make sure you have the right materials. The mechanical pencil I used initially for my exam was too faint, even though it was HB just as specified, so I was glad I brought a spare regular pencil, even though the centre actually ended up giving us all pencils anyway. Check and double check that you have everything you need, like an eraser and sharpener. You may notice that I didn't follow a lot of these rules, and it was a big mistake. Please make sure you're not hungry, cold and tired like I was on the day of the test. Now I'm going to go into some of the things I personally did to help me with the different sections of the test. We're all different, so my methods may not work for you, but I just wanted to share them so that you can at least give them a try to see what they can do for you. There are 2 parts to the language knowledge section. Grammar and vocabulary. The vocabulary section has questions where you match the reading of a kanji to the character, and a section where you match the kanji to the reading. You may think that you need to study kanji individually for this part. That's not the most helpful thing to do, at least not at the higher levels. The questions rarely ask for the reading of an individual kanji unless the individual kanji forms a word by itself, so you're better off learning full words in their readings as opposed to just kanji in their readings. The most efficient way to do this is using a spaced repetition site or app like Memrise, Anki or Quizlet. Paper flashcards also work for the same purpose. I personally used Anki a lot for vocabulary acquisition and it was extremely helpful, but use whatever works for you. Making your own cards is, in general, the best way to go about learning because it's more personalised, and even the time spent making the cards is time spent learning the words, because you're interacting with them as you look them up, and that's great. But for an exam as popular as the JLPT, there are lots of good shared Anki or Memrise or Quizlet decks that have vocabulary for each level. I learnt most of my grammar online just by searching N2 grammar lists or looking up a grammar point. I didn't do much directed grammar learning because I didn't know how and I found it quite boring, so grammar was and still sort of is my weak point. I also didn't focus on it too much because there's no output section on the JLPT. I use YouTube channels like Nihongo no Mori and Riki Nihongo Dayo to learn and practice vocabulary and grammar. Both of these channels are more geared towards N3 and upwards. Nihongo no Mori especially does a lot of live streams near the date of the exam, which are really helpful because they give a bunch of example questions and explain the answers. I personally really like studying kanji. I know some people find it the hardest part of Japanese, and I understand why they'd say that. Kanji was a big part of why I decided to study Japanese in the first place. I just find them so interesting and it's so satisfying to recognise a new kanji in a different context. I mostly just read a lot to improve my kanji skills, and I will say that the news will be your best friend for the N2. I kept a daily journal in Japanese for a long while in 2020 and continued to write fairly regularly in 2021. This will help you to keep all of that grammar and vocabulary in your active memory. I'd make a point to try and use all of the new words I learned in my journal entry for the day. I'd also like to mention that I don't really like taking notes. I do occasionally like to note down something if I think it's really important, but I don't tend to look back at my notes either. The simple act of writing something down is usually enough to learn it, and if it isn't, then I'll just wait till the next time I encounter it to write it again and try to remember it. If I don't see the word or grammar point again, it probably wasn't important enough to know. That rule applies a lot more for the lower levels. It's also one of the big reasons why I don't really see myself doing the N1 in the future. I just don't feel like cramming my head full of vocabulary and kanji that I don't really see very often and I'm not really going to use a lot. I'm just going to end up forgetting them anyway. It's very important to practice the different types of questions. There's a specific type of question in the grammar section that can trip you up if you're seeing it for the first time. You're given a sentence that's split into 4 phrases, and there's a star of the part of the sentence that's the correct answer, for example, the first part. So you need to first reorder the parts to get the full correct sentence, and then you need to pick the part that was highlighted by the star. That explanation wasn't great, but if you do them in practice papers, you'll get the hang of it. It's not insanely complicated, it's just hard to explain and takes a bit of getting used to. I managed to get a 60 out of 60 in the language knowledge section, which is amazing for me. I did expect to do well because kanji and vocabulary are my strong point, but it was good to see that grammar didn't let me down. I also see that as proof that those lists online with all the N2 kanji and N2 vocabulary are actually quite accurate because I used a lot of those and a lot of Anki decks that were specifically N2 kanji or N2 vocabulary, and I ended up doing really well. Now, I really enjoy reading Japanese, especially the news and fictional stories. So one incredible resource for reading at an advanced level is the news. I know I said it was boring earlier, but that's more about the news itself. Like, I love reading the news, but sometimes there's not a lot going on, so all of the news articles are just the same, or it's really trivial, and that's what I don't like. But actually reading the news is a really interesting thing for me. It was my way of keeping up with things, because I don't like to read the news in English that much anymore. But anyway, the news is readily available and professionally written, so you can be assured of its correctness. I know some people might find it boring or depressing to read the news, but it doesn't have to be the front page news from major outlets. Pick something that you enjoy. There's probably some kind of news site or blog for it. I read almost daily from the NHK news site, especially in October of 2020, when the American presidential election was going on. Now, I don't care about politics, much less American politics, but it was a continuous story that was being reported on every single day, so it was very easy to get used to all of the characters involved. and usually there'd only be short updates every day, so it's easy to stay on top of it all. I did end up learning quite a few words that I'd never need relating to things like positions in the Senate, but overall, the reading practice was a huge benefit. This is also another opportunity to use your journal. I personally would write a quick summary of whatever news article I read that day and add my thoughts on the topic before moving on to writing out about my day. It's a good exercise to see how much you understand about the topic and to solidify any new things that you've learned. I used Anki mostly when I was reading. I would read on my phone during meals or online classes, and I would copy and paste sentences with words I didn't know into Anki from the NHK website and look up any unknown words on Weblio, or Jisho if the Japanese definition was too hard to understand or too technical, and make decks like that. They'd usually be separated by resource, like I'd group all of my new sentences into one deck, and if I got the word from another source, there'd be another more vague deck for that. I personally like to insist on using a monolingual dictionary like Weblio for all of my definitions. I just think it's easier to keep your head in the language when you use a monolingual dictionary, and at an advanced level, it's easier to understand the nuances of the word. If you're at a lower level, or if the Japanese definition is too difficult, just use a bilingual dictionary, but I do recommend just checking out a monolingual definition every once in a while, just to see what it's like and if you can understand it. One great resource I stumbled upon in 2020 was a fan translation of the Sherlock Holmes series. I personally love the Sherlock Holmes books, and getting to read them again in Japanese was a fun challenge. They have all of the books translated on the site, and I'll link to it in the description of the video, so be sure to check them out. If you've read the Sherlock Holmes books before, you know that the language used and some of the terms are very outdated due to the age of the writing, and although the Japanese grammar is modern in the translations, in order to preserve the original meaning, they use the Japanese words for old concepts like the currency used at the time. I did look these words up, but I didn't make any conscious effort to learn them since they're not very useful to know, and it gets easier as you keep reading to notice which words are antiquated. I made an Anki deck for the first book of the Sherlock Holmes series with almost 500 cards. It's a pretty basic deck, and some of the words don't even have furigana because I already knew their meanings, but it worked for me and I used to use that a lot. Make sure you use past JLPT papers to get a feel of the length and content of the reading section. You should be doing past papers anyway, but you should definitely focus on the reading section to see the difficulty of the text and how much time you'd need to complete it. This is where I'd always hear that other people struggled with time. If you're not too close to the date of the exam, you should attempt the reading section without timing yourself and read the entirety of the text and highlight everything you don't understand. This will help you get a feel of what you know and what you don't know, and you can see whether or not you need to focus hard on kanji or vocabulary or grammar. Then as the test date approaches, you can set a timer for completing each question and the full section. Aim to have a couple of minutes at the end to review. If you want to complete the test on time, you're going to have to learn to skim read. This is a useful skill in general, but can be hard to master in a foreign language. You should only fully read the first sentence in a paragraph, then just cut through to anything important like dates, times and places. Try to look for words like need, urgent or important within the text too. The only certain way of getting better at skim reading is to practice a lot. Take a news article on NHK or NHK Easy and read through it as fast as you can. It doesn't necessarily have to be a news article, but it has to be a relatively short piece about a new topic that you have not read before. Then you should write everything that you remember from the article. Compare this to the original article and see if you think you captured the main essence properly. This should start very early in your revision and continue up to your last session so that you're certain you can complete the reading section with relatively good accuracy. I got 56 out of 60 in the reading section, which is higher than I expected. I love reading and I read a lot, but the texts in the exam are all quite boring and long, and there were times that I thought that I'd completely misunderstood the passage or the question, but I just couldn't be bothered to read it again, so I just pressed forward. And it worked out, I suppose, so don't stress yourself out too much about it. Now, listening comprehension was the skill I focused on the least in the run-up to the exam because it was one of my strongest skills. I did still make sure to do practice exams and I scored quite well on them. The reason why my listening was quite good is because I started learning Japanese when I was 12 and I didn't really have much else to do, so I used to spend hours on end on YouTube, like literally 8+ hours in a day, and when I started learning Japanese, I immediately started watching Japanese YouTubers. And getting that amount of exposure over around 5 years made me very good at understanding casual spoken Japanese. My understanding of honorific and humble Japanese was slightly worse because I'd rarely hear them, but even then I was able to capture enough to answer a question, so it worked out. I made a whole video about the Japanese YouTubers I watch, and you can watch that one after this if you're interested. I did more focused listening practice with past papers I found on YouTube. There are quite a few channels that upload listening tests with the answers, which are good free resources. If you have a JLPT textbook that focuses on listening, it should come with some practice questions that you can use as well. Another tip that I have for improving your listening is to transcribe parts of media. I talk about this all the time, but this can be a segment of the news, radio or podcast, and I personally do this very often with songs. They're not too long, they're fun to listen to over and over again, and I want to know the lyrics, so why not transcribe them? Depending on your level, you can transcribe them in hiragana or with the kanji. I personally preferred writing my transcriptions down on paper because I'm very slow at typing in Japanese, but feel free to do this however you want. And also news companies post short news clips onto YouTube, so you can watch these for some listening comprehension as well, or give yourself the challenge of transcribing them. If you're able to do that, I'd say you're more than ready for the JLPT in my opinion. So that's going to be it for this video. I couldn't explain absolutely everything about the exam, so if you have any questions, leave a comment down below and I'll do my best to answer. And if you have your own tips to share, leave a comment down below. A lot of people, including me, would love to hear it. Also feel free to share your own anecdotes of times you've taken language exams, JLPT or otherwise. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. Thank you so much for watching.